Karen Whitfield swept her gaze across the first-class cabin, her designer sunglasses hiding the sharp glint of judgment as she categorized passengers into those who belonged and those who didn't. When a black man settled into the seat beside her with a young white girl, Karen's practiced disdain curdled into something uglier. By the time the plane touched down 3 hours later, her baseless suspicions would lead to a confrontation that would shatter her carefully constructed worldview. But before we go on, make sure to watch this story until the end. Her reaction? That's where it gets really good. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The airport terminal buzzed with activity as travelers navigated crowded walkways, lugging suitcases and balancing overpriced coffees. Karen Whitfield sighed heavily as she stepped out of the security line, tugging at the strap of her designer handbag. The morning hadn't gone as planned. The line at security had crawled. She'd been forced to remove her shoes. Utterly barbaric, she thought. And her latte was lukewarm. As if that wasn't enough, a court attendant at the gate had informed her that one of her carry-ons needed to be checked due to limited space in the overhead bins. Karen had nearly argued, but relented with a sharp comment about the airline's incompetence. Now, as she finally approached her boarding group for first class, her irritation simmered just below the surface. She stepped onto the plane, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin. First-class passengers were settling into their seats, placing expensive handbags under seats and chatting softly. Karen immediately began sizing up her surroundings. A man in a wrinkled blazer stuffing his laptop bag into the overhead compartment. A woman in yoga pants scrolling through her phone. Not very first-class behavior, Karen thought disdainfully. When she reached her row, she froze. Sitting in the aisle seat was a tall black man with neatly cropped hair, wearing a pressed button-down shirt. He was carefully tucking a tablet into the seat pocket. Beside him, in the middle seat, was a little girl. She had bright blonde hair, tied into pigtails with pink ribbons, and was flipping through a picture book filled with colorful illustrations of princesses. Karen's eyes darted between the two, her mind racing. "Excuse me," Karen said sharply, pointing toward the window seat. "That's mine." The man looked up and smiled politely. "Of course." He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Karen squeezed past him without saying a word, sliding into her seat. As she settled in, she couldn't resist glancing at the pair out of the corner of her eye. The man helped the girl fasten her seatbelt, then handed her the tablet, which now displayed an animated storybook app. "Look, Daddy," the girl squealed, pointing at the screen. "Which one's your favorite princess, Lily?" the man asked, leaning closer. Karen stiffened. The use of Daddy jolted her. She looked at them again, her gaze lingering a little too long. Is he really her father, she wondered? The pairing seemed unusual. Lily giggled, her high-pitched laughter filling the cabin. "Can you keep it down, please?" Karen snapped, her voice cutting through the air. "Some of us value peace and quiet." The man turned toward her, his expression calm, but his voice firm. "I'll do my best to keep her entertained quietly." Karen didn't respond, instead folding her arms and staring out the window. But she couldn't let it go. Something about the man, his confidence, his calm demeanor, rubbed her the wrong way. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and ensuring passengers were ready for takeoff. Karen leaned toward one of them, a young woman named Heather Wallace. "Excuse me," Karen whispered. "Is there a way to move me to another seat? I don't feel comfortable here." Heather furrowed her brow. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're fully booked. Is something wrong?" Karen hesitated, glancing back at David and Lily. "No," she said finally, her tone clipped. "I'll manage." Heather gave her a tight smile and moved on. As the plane taxied down the runway, Karen found herself unable to focus on her book. Lily was now chattering happily about the princesses on the tablet, while the man, David, she'd overheard Lily call him, responded patiently. Karen's disapproval grew with every exchange. She couldn't understand why she felt so unsettled. When the plane finally leveled out at cruising altitude, Heather returned with a tray of drinks. Karen seized the opportunity. "Excuse me again," Karen said, her voice low but pointed. "I don't mean to be a bother, but don't you find that pairing odd?" Heather blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. What pairing?" Karen tilted her head toward David and Lily. "The two of them. I mean, I don't want to assume anything, but don't airlines usually ask for identification when an adult travels with a child? Heather's expression tightened. Ma'am, every passenger here was thoroughly checked before boarding. Is there a specific concern you have? Karen faltered. No, it's unusual, isn't it? A man like him with a little girl like that? Heather's jaw clenched. I assure you everything is in order. Please enjoy your flight. Karen huffed, leaning back into her seat, unsatisfied. As the flight continued, Karen's irritation only deepened. Every time David helped Lily with something, a dropped crayon, a tangled earbud cord, Karen's gaze flicked toward them, her thoughts spiraling. At one point, Lily leaned into David's arm, her small voice carrying over the hum of the cabin. Daddy, when we get to Disneyland, can we see the castle first? Of course, sweetheart, David said, brushing her hair back gently. Karen's lips thinned. Daddy, she thought again. How convenient. She reached for her drink, muttering under her breath. Some people will say anything to look legitimate. David turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the flight began. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Karen quickly looked away, heat rising to her cheeks. Heather passed by again, her watchful eyes taking in the tension between Karen and her roommates. She paused, leaning toward Karen. Ma'am, she said softly, if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know. But I would advise letting others enjoy their flight as well. Karen stared at her, stunned into silence. Heather straightened and moved on. For the rest of the flight, Karen sat stiffly, her thoughts churning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and she couldn't understand why no one else seemed to see it. As the plane began its descent, Karen cast one more glance at David and Lily. They were laughing together, Lily pointing out the window at the clouds. David's smile was warm, genuine. Karen's unease deepened, but she told herself she'd done the right thing by speaking up. People were too quick to overlook things these days. She at least had the courage to question what others ignored. What Karen didn't realize was that her assumptions were about to unravel in the most humiliating way possible. The plane roared to life as it prepared for takeoff, and Karen Whitfield sat rigidly in her window seat, her posture as tight as her forced smile. The sight of David Carter and his daughter Lily next to her had thrown her off balance, and her discomfort was growing by the second. As the engines hummed louder, Karen couldn't help but sneak glances at them. David was adjusting Lily's seatbelt, speaking to her in a calm, reassuring voice. Is that okay? Not too tight? He asked gently. Lily grinned up at him. Perfect, Daddy. Karen stiffened at the word Daddy. She watched as David checked the fit one more time, ensuring his daughter was secure. The interaction grated on her nerves. Finally, Karen couldn't hold back. Her voice, sharp and disapproving, cut through the hum of the cabin. Don't you think it's a bit inappropriate to be so hands-on? She can buckle herself in. David turned his head toward her, startled but composed. She's 5, he said evenly, his tone carrying no malice. Still, Karen muttered, her voice low but loud enough for others to hear. Kids need boundaries. Lily looked up at Karen, confused by the comment but staying silent. David placed a hand on her shoulder, his focus solely on his daughter. Why don't we check out the princesses on your tablet, sweetheart? He said, his tone warm and steady. Karen scoffed and turned toward the window, trying to ignore the bubbling irritation inside her. Something about David's calmness unsettled her. It wasn't defiance, it was worse. He didn't seem to care about her opinion. The plane leveled out after takeoff, and the cabin became a steady hum of activity as passengers settled in. Heather, the flight attendant, made her way through first class, checking on passengers. Karen flagged her down with a quick wave. Excuse me, Karen whispered, leaning toward Heather conspiratorially. I don't want to make a fuss, but do you think everything is legitimate over there? She nodded subtly toward David and Lily. Heather tilted her head, frowning slightly. I'm sorry, ma'am. What do you mean? Karen sighed, as though she were explaining something obvious. Well, it's not my business, but doesn't it seem odd? A man like him, with a little girl like that? Heather's frown deepened. Ma'am, I assure you, everything was thoroughly checked before boarding. There's nothing unusual about a father traveling with his daughter. Karen's lips thinned. Well, I think it's odd, she said curtly, folding her arms. Heather straightened, her tone polite but firm. If there's nothing specific you need, I'll continue with my service. She moved down the aisle, leaving Karen to stew in her thoughts. Karen couldn't shake her discomfort. Every time David and Lily interacted, her mind raced with assumptions. When David handed Lily her headphones and helped her connect them to the tablet, Karen's irritation flared again. Was he trying too hard? Wasn't it strange how smoothly everything seemed between them? At one point, Lily rested her head on David's arm, her voice soft but audible. Daddy, can I have the pink princess dress at the store? David chuckled, his tone light. We'll see. First, we need to find Mickey Mouse, remember? Karen stared straight ahead, her jaw tightening. Mickey Mouse, she muttered under her breath. How convenient. David noticed her comment but didn't react. He leaned closer to Lily. How about we play a game while we wait for the snacks? Lily nodded enthusiastically, her giggle filling the small space around them. Karen reached for her drink, muttering louder this time. Some people will do anything to make things look normal. David turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers briefly. His expression wasn't hostile. It was unreadable, a calmness that only fueled Karen's frustration. Karen flagged Heather down again as she passed by. This time, her voice was firmer, her tone laced with urgency. I think someone should check on them. Heather sighed, clearly tired of the conversation. Ma'am, what exactly do you think needs checking? Karen leaned closer, lowering her voice but making sure she was still heard. I don't want to make accusations, but we live in a time where you can't be too careful. You've seen the news. Heather folded her arms, her patience wearing thin. Ma'am, unless you have a specific concern or evidence, I suggest you enjoy your flight and let them enjoy theirs. Karen's cheeks flushed. I just think it's irresponsible to ignore the signs. Heather held her gaze for a moment before walking away without a word. Karen huffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Time crawled by as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet. Karen's irritation simmered with every interaction between David and Lily. At one point, David took out a notebook and began sketching something. Lily leaned over, watching with fascination. Is that a castle? She asked. Sort of, David replied, shading a turret with precise strokes. It's the Disneyland castle. Thought we could make a little map of what we want to see. Lily clapped her hands in delight. Can we put Mickey's house on it too? Of course, David said, smiling. Karen couldn't hold back any longer. She turned slightly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Quite the planner, aren't we? David looked up from his drawing, his expression calm but curious. Is there something you'd like to say? He asked, his voice steady. Karen opened her mouth but hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, she settled on a dismissive, just seems a little over the top. David didn't reply. Instead, he handed the notebook to Lily and encouraged her to add her favorite rides to the drawing. By the time the flight attendants brought out snacks, Karen had convinced herself that something wasn't right. She leaned toward the passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged man engrossed in his book. Don't you think it's strange? Karen whispered. A man like that traveling with a little girl? The man glanced at her, confused. Strange? No, I don't think so. Karen sighed heavily. Well, I do. The man returned to his book without responding, leaving Karen feeling isolated but undeterred. The cabin had settled into a steady rhythm. Passengers were reading, napping, or scrolling through their phones. The hum of the engines filled the air with a sense of calm, except for Karen Whitfield, whose discomfort had grown unbearable. Every glance at David and Lily fanned the flames of her indignation. It wasn't just the way they interacted, Karen told herself. It was the principle. Something didn't sit right with her about the pairing, and she was convinced she had a duty to act. Her chance came when David excused himself to use the restroom. Lily, engrossed in her tablet, struggled to navigate a new game. She tapped the screen repeatedly, letting out a small huff of frustration. Karen leaned over, her expression soft but condescending. Sweetheart, she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Where's your mommy? Does she know you're with him? Lily looked up, puzzled. "That's my daddy," she said proudly, a big smile on her face. Karen's forced smile tightened. "Are you sure about that? It's okay if you're scared. You can tell me." Lily's smile faltered, confusion flashing across her face. She tilted her head. "Why would I be scared? Daddy's the best." Heather, the flight attendant, caught the interaction as she moved through the aisle. Noticing Lily's confusion and Karen's tone, she stepped forward, her voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" Karen sat back in her seat, crossing her arms. "I'm just concerned for the child. You can't be too careful these days." Heather's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I assure you, there's no reason for concern. Lily is perfectly safe." Karen scoffed, her voice rising slightly. "You don't know that. You're just taking his word for it." Lily, growing visibly upset, clutched her tablet to her chest. "Why are you being mean?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Before Heather could respond, David returned to the row. His expression shifted instantly when he saw Lily's teary eyes and the tension between Karen and the flight attendant. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Karen's scoff was louder this time. "I think we all deserve to know if it is." David frowned, glancing between Karen and Heather. "What are you implying?" Karen straightened, emboldened by her own indignation. "I'm implying that it's unusual, suspicious even, for a man like you to be traveling with a little girl like her. We've all read the stories. It's better to be cautious than sorry." Gasps rippled through the cabin as nearby passengers turned their attention to the confrontation. Heather's face flushed red with disbelief and anger. "Ma'am," she said, her voice controlled but firm, "this is not appropriate. You're making baseless accusations." Karen refused to back down. "What if something happens to that child because you ignored the signs? It's your job to ensure passenger safety." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Lily is my daughter," he said firmly. "I adopted her 2 years ago after fostering her. I have all the necessary documents, but I shouldn't have to prove myself to you or anyone else." Karen waved him off dismissively. "People lie all the time. You could have forged papers for all we know." She turned to Heather, pointing an accusatory finger. "And you'll regret it if something happens. You should at least check his credentials. It's your responsibility." Heather took a deep breath, her patience hanging by a thread. "This is the last time I'll ask you to stop causing a scene, ma'am. David Carter and Lily are passengers just like you, and they deserve to travel without harassment." Karen glared at David, her voice icy. "We'll see what the authorities think when we land." The cabin was silent now, all eyes on the row where the confrontation had unfolded. Karen sat back in her seat, her arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. David turned his attention to Lily, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. "Hey, princess," he said softly. "Are you okay?" Lily nodded, though her lower lip trembled. "That lady is mean," she whispered. David's heart clenched, but he forced a small smile. "Don't worry about her. She doesn't know us, right?" Lily nodded again, more firmly this time. "She doesn't know how awesome you are, Daddy." David kissed the top of her head. "That's right. Now, let's finish our map for Disneyland." As David comforted Lily, Karen watched with thinly veiled disdain. She couldn't understand why no one else seemed to see the obvious problem here. The murmurs from other passengers began quietly, but grew louder as Heather walked to the back of the plane to consult with her team. "This is ridiculous," one man whispered to his seatmate. "That poor guy." "I can't believe she said that out loud," a woman muttered, shaking her head. Heather returned a few minutes later, her expression steely. She knelt beside Karen's seat, lowering her voice but keeping it firm. "Ma'am," she said, "I need to make this clear. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will have to escalate this with airport security upon landing. I strongly suggest you remain quiet for the rest of the flight." Karen's eyes widened, indignant. "Are you threatening me?" "No, ma'am," Heather replied. "I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions." Karen huffed but said nothing, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. David remained composed, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the weight of the moment. He glanced around the cabin, meeting sympathetic gazes from other passengers. Though no one had intervened directly, their quiet support bolstered him. As the plane began its descent, Lily reached for his hand. "I'm glad we're almost there," she said softly. David squeezed her hand. "Me too, sweetheart." Karen, meanwhile, sat stiffly, her mind racing. She still believed she'd done the right thing, but the subtle judgment from the other passengers gnawed at her. She clung to the idea that the authorities would vindicate her once they landed. But Karen was about to learn just how deeply wrong she'd been, and how public her humiliation would be. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels screeching against the runway as the cabin filled with the familiar clicks of seatbelts being undone. Karen Whitfield exhaled deeply, a smirk tugging at her lips. She was convinced she had done her civic duty. Soon, she thought, the authorities would see her point. After all, wasn't it better to be cautious than to let something slip through the cracks? As passengers stood to gather their belongings, Karen remained seated for a moment, her eyes flitting toward David and Lily. He was calmly helping his daughter secure her bag, his demeanor as composed as ever. Karen's annoyance flared again. Why wasn't he showing any signs of guilt or discomfort? Probably knows how to play the part, she thought smugly. David, sensing her gaze, glanced at Karen briefly before turning back to Lily. "Ready, princess?" Lily nodded eagerly, clutching the small stuffed bunny she had pulled from her bag. "Ready, Daddy?" Karen rolled her eyes as she stood, adjusting the strap of her purse. "Let's see how ready you are when the authorities get involved," she muttered under her breath. The passengers filed off the plane in a slow, orderly line. Karen, close behind David and Lily, kept her head high. As they stepped into the bustling terminal, Karen glanced around, expecting to see airport security waiting. Instead, she noticed a small crowd gathered near the gate's exit. At first, she thought it was a group of travelers waiting for a family member, but as they moved closer, Karen realized this wasn't an ordinary welcome party. Several people held signs emblazoned with phrases like, "Welcome, Dr. Carter," and "Thank you for saving lives." Cameras flashed as reporters jostled for position, their voices overlapping as they called out questions. Karen froze mid-step, her purse slipping slightly from her shoulder. "What's this?" she muttered, her confidence faltering. David's calm never wavered as he walked toward the crowd, his hand resting protectively on Lily's tiny fingers, a quiet confidence that made Karen's doubts feel smaller by the second. The crowd erupted into cheers, and a tall man in a sharp suit stepped forward, shaking David's hand with enthusiasm. "Dr. Carter," the man said, his voice carrying over the noise, "we're honored to have you here for the charity gala. Your work has inspired us all." Karen's stomach dropped. She turned to a fellow passenger, an older woman who had been seated a few rows back. What's happening?" Karen asked, her voice shaky. The woman raised an eyebrow, her tone laced with disbelief. "You don't know who he is? That's Dr. David Carter, the pediatric surgeon. He's famous for his work with children in underserved communities." Karen's heart sank as the woman continued, her words like daggers. "I read he's adopted kids who were in the foster system, too. A real hero." Karen's mouth went dry. She clutched her purse strap tightly, her knuckles turning white. The reality hit her like a freight train. The man she had spent the entire flight scrutinizing, judging, and accusing wasn't just a father. He was a renowned doctor and humanitarian. And now, he stood in the middle of the terminal, surrounded by people who admired and respected him. Karen's world tilted as the truth unraveled. The man she had condemned in her mind was not only innocent, he was extraordinary. Her cheeks burned, but the weight in her chest was far heavier than embarrassment. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Dr. Carter, can you tell us what motivates your work with pediatric patients and foster care programs?" David smiled humbly, his grip tightening slightly on Lily's hand. "It's simple," he said. "Every child deserves a chance, no matter their background, no matter the circumstances. I was lucky enough to have people believe in me, so it's my responsibility to do the same for others." Lily beamed up at him, her earlier distress forgotten. Karen's face burned as she remembered her own words from the flight. Kids need boundaries. People lie all the time. Every comment now felt like a glaring stain, exposing her prejudice for all the world to see, even if only she knew it. Heather, the flight attendant, passed by Karen on her way out of the gate. She paused briefly, leaning in just enough for Karen to hear her words. "Looks like you misjudged him," Heather said, her tone sharp but quiet. "Maybe next time think twice before making assumptions." Karen didn't respond. She couldn't. David, still surrounded by admirers, never glanced back at Karen. He kept his focus on Lily and the people welcoming him. "Daddy," Lily said, tugging at his hand, "why are they taking pictures?" David knelt to her level, his voice soft. "They're just excited about the work we're doing to help kids like you, sweetheart. It's nothing to worry about." Lily nodded, satisfied. "Can we go see Mickey now?" David laughed, standing. "Soon, princess. Soon." Karen stood frozen, her mind racing as David and Lily walked away, swallowed by the crowd. For the rest of her trip, Karen was haunted by her actions. Every memory of the flight, the whispered accusations, the smug remarks, the condescension toward Lily, now filled her with shame. She'd always prided herself on her judgment, her ability to read people. But this time, she'd gotten it disastrously wrong. And worse, her assumptions had been rooted in something she wasn't ready to confront: her own biases. As Karen waited for her connecting flight, she avoided the glances of the other passengers from the plane. She could feel their judgment now, silent but palpable, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. She pulled out her phone, staring blankly at the screen. A thought crept into her mind, unwelcome but persistent. What if someone had filmed me? What if the world knew what I'd said, what I'd done? The idea made her stomach churn. But even without cameras capturing her actions, Karen knew the damage had been done. Not to David. He was untouchable in his integrity, a fact she now fully understood. The damage was to herself. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.